Game Transmigration, Saving the World Again 1000 Years Later. Chapter 1, End. Translator, C. Talon. I guess it's almost time. Zhou Mu drew across the seemingly endless list of completed missions and muttered. More than 200 main missions, more than 2,000 side missions, more than 1,000 hidden environments, and all the achievements had been collected. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that he had completed all the game content that the developers of the VR RPG virtual reality role-playing game Doomsday Watchers had designed. Platinuming a game couldn't get any better. As Zhou Mu flipped through the game's records, he sighed at how much effort he had put into this game. Man, did I spend more than 13,000 hours on this game. This is a little exaggerated for a single-player game. Is there a second person in the world who has thrown more than 10,000 hours into the game? Zhou Mu was surprised by the time he spent via the record breakdown. Zhou Mu had always believed that he wasn't really living as a human during the 10+ hours he toiled at his company. If he made this the measure of choice and deducted the time he spent sleeping every day, he was akin to a person living in the sword and magical world of Doomsday Watchers than in the real world. However, all good things had to come to an end. It was finally time to say goodbye to this world. With this in mind, Zhou Mu, who felt his heart gradually grow heavy, waved his hand and closed the statistics interface. It wasn't that he was tired of this game compared to the real world where he had to face all kinds of pressure every day. He found serenity from just looking at the scenery in the game's Vic continent. If possible, he really hoped that he could continue living this other life in-game. However, the pressure of reality was ever present. Having crossed the 30-year-old threshold, Zhou Mu could already sense the invisible shackles gradually tightening, the shocking results of his physical examination, the pressure from his mortgage and car loans, the rumors in the company about retrenching older employees, and so on. He had to sacrifice sleep to squeeze out an hour or two for gaming. Meanwhile, his body, which hadn't been in the pinkest of health for a long time, had already begun to issue constant alarms. In the past half a year, he had fainted twice without any warning. His doctor and boss had seriously talked to him more than once. Suffering a sudden death or being retrenched weren't outcomes he wanted. After weighing the pros and cons, it was time to quit. Zhou Mu looked up and surveyed his surroundings. At this moment, he was sitting at a huge obsidian round table in the middle of a magnificent hall that was like a pantheon in Rome. This was the Round Table Hall in the Twilight Fortress. Twilight Fortress was the headquarters of the Doomsday Watchers, a Salvation Army that wasn't restricted by borders. It was the closest place to home for players, and it was also the first stronghold the players arrived at in the main storyline. Before leaving completely, Zhou Mu planned on giving himself a ceremonial farewell. Choosing this place to end it all could be said to be of extraordinary significance. It was both the beginning and the end. Zhou Mu sat for a while longer when he heard chaotic footsteps outside. Then, the heavy adamantine door was pushed open, and the entire round table hall was divided into two by the light coming from the outside. The 12 men and women of different races entered one after another with the light as a backdrop and sat at the round table. Players could directly recruit 12 core NPCs to take up the Doomsday Watchers' 13 judges and, together, they would save the world with the protagonist based on the plot. Zhou Mu swept his gaze across everyone present. Of course, not all of them were humans. There were also companions from other races. He couldn't help but recall the foolish things he had done in the past. Back then, to achieve a perfect clear, he basically had to reload dozens of times to farm satisfactory basic stats and characteristics for the NPCs to be recruited to be his judge. Moreover, he would choose the perk that suited them best to have synergy between their equipment. It could be said that every judge's character build was better than what most ordinary gamers of Doomsday Watchers had. Presiding Judge William Kane, what gives us the pleasure of being summoned here? Perhaps the system had determined that Zhou Mu hadn't spoken for too long, so a character in pitch-black armor and carrying a huge sword that was as thick as a door spoke. William Kane was the name of Zhou Mu's character in this save. Zhou Mu came back to his senses and cleared his throat. That's right, Blake Saba. I summoned all the judges here today because I have something important to announce. As Zhou Mu spoke, he took a deep breath and spread his arms. I'm about to leave you forever. With that said, all the NPCs at the round table revealed looks of disbelief, panic, and even fear. The production company of Doomsday Watchers assigned extremely powerful AI programs for important NPCs in the game. As long as they didn't talk about things that went beyond the game's framework, their conversation and reaction were very close to that of a real person. Of course, this was essentially just a chat program. Zhou Mu also knew that he was being silly bidding farewell to these NPCs. William, my friend, are you saying that you want to leave the Vic continent and adventure elsewhere? A scaly man with horns on his head and a thick tail on his back asked in a gruff voice. No, Dao King, I'm not just leaving this continent, but this entire world. With that said, there was another commotion. Are you saying that you plan on leaving Career and heading to the Moon Realm to head to the domain ruled by those void sovereigns? In that case, I ask to be part of your noble party. A humanoid wrapped in a cloak that constantly emitted ominous black mist asked in a singing tone. I'm not talking about Career or the Moon Realm. I'm talking about the entire world, everything. It reaches far beyond the present, the Moon Realm, the Light Realm, or the furthest border you can imagine. Only I can walk this path. I can only take my fond memories of you, nothing more. An elven girl wearing light leather armor and carrying a transparent bow and arrow on her back asked, Lord Kane, can you tell us why you have decided to leave? Because I have no choice. I do wish I could accompany all of you forever. But far away, some existences are graver than the 7 calamities and the void sovereigns that require me to fight them. What's that? Reality. The room fell silent. Every judge seemed to be thinking hard about what Zhou Mu meant by reality. Of course, Zhou Mu knew that it was impossible. It was just that the system had detected a conversation that went beyond the game's framework. In turn, it made the NPCs act as if they were in thought. They would then immediately change the topic. Then, the youngest-looking youth among the 12 spoke. He wore a cloak woven from black feathers and had amber eyes that resembled those of a ferocious bird. Will you be returning? I don't know, Coles, I'm not sure, but if that day really comes, I hope to see all of you again. I'll look forward to the day we reunite. As Zhou Mu spoke, he pressed his hands on the obsidian round table and stood up. The other 12 people in front of the round table stood up with him. He looked at his companions in a daze. If only this world were real. Then, I hereby announce the disbandment of the 13 judges. We have brought 1,000 years of peace to this world by defeating the calamities and expelling the void sovereign. It's high time to seek out your own happiness. This is my last order, everyone, do as you wish. What an idiotic speech. They were clearly just programs stored in the computer, and as long as he went offline, they would freeze at this moment forever. Yet, he still shamelessly said to them that he wanted them to pursue their own happiness. The thing about, the day we reunite, was even more impossible. He had already sold his gaming pod on an online platform. Tomorrow, he would pack it up and send it out. Reuniting was impossible. When Zhou Mu thought of this, he bowed to everyone and silently activated the nexus on the obsidian round table. Teleportation. After a brief loading interface, Zhou Mu arrived in an alternate space filled with stars. This was his treasure haul. He had too many rare items in his collection. Having a hoarder mentality, not only would he obtain things through the game's progression, but he could even produce useless assets that the developers ultimately didn't put into the game through the console. If it was only for display, the entire Twilight Fortress wouldn't be enough to hold half of his collection as a treasure haul. Therefore, he created such an alternate space through the game console that was specially used to store his vast collection. Every star in this boundless cosmos was a rare item wrapped in a spacetime bubble. Zhou Mu looked up at the stars in the sky. Then, farewell. He took a deep breath and pulled up the game menu before pressing the Exit Game button. His vision instantly turned pitch black. A notification alert would indicate that he had successfully logged off, returning him to the real world. Zhou Mu silently counted his breaths and waited for the chime. For some reason, his subtle and mixed feelings became extremely calm. Chapter 2, Beginning. Is it stuck? Sensing that something was amiss, Zhou Mu tried pulling out the game menu, but he failed. Game pod, log off. Nothing. Game pod, force disconnection. There was still no reaction. A trace of fear surfaced from his heart. He had read an urban legend on a forum that someone had died in a game pod due to a malfunction. He had always written it off as a joke. After all, the VR game pod wasn't connected to the back of his head. There shouldn't be anything that sounded too sci-fi like being trapped in a game pod. But when he realized that he couldn't log off normally, he couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. Game pod, forceful eject. Contact customer service. As Zhou Mu shouted all kinds of emergency orders, he raised his hand and planned on ripping off the VR helmet on his head. However, he was stunned the next second. What his hand touched wasn't the helmet but his face. Before he could figure out what this meant, Zhou Mu's vision suddenly lit up again. In front of him was a starry scene. He had returned to the treasure hall he was in before going offline. What's going on? Zhou Mu tried touching his face. At this moment, he wasn't wearing a VR helmet. He then touched the spot on his neck where the zipper of his sensor suit should have been, but he could only touch his Adam's apple. This meant that he wasn't wearing a force transmission suit or a VR helmet that could simulate his 5 senses. However, he still saw the scene of stars filling the treasure hall. It even looked clearer than before. It was as clear as the real world. An extremely ridiculous possibility surfaced in Zhou Mu's heart, causing his heart to race. Then, I'll test it. Zhou Mu gulped. Teleportation. There was no game UI interface or character interface, but when Zhou Mu thought of using teleportation, a gorgeous and complicated nexus automatically appeared in front of him. Then, many specks of light that symbolized coordinates appeared in his mind. In Doomsday Watchers, teleportation was equivalent to a quick travel function. Therefore, to teleport to a certain location, players had to first visit the location and unlock the coordinates there. Zhou Mu tried choosing the coordinates that symbolized the round table. As the nexus flashed, he appeared in the seat where he had bid farewell to the judges. Even the loading interface during teleportation in the past no longer existed. He looked at his hands in disbelief, finding it unbelievable that everything in front of him was real. So, did I transmigrate? No game in the world could complete a player's instructions with a thought. If he hadn't gone crazy from the pressure of work, there was only one possibility: he had transmigrated to the world of Doomsday Watchers. It was difficult to say what complicated changes Zhou Mu's emotions had undergone after he realized that he had transmigrated, but one thing was certain: he definitely didn't have the intention of returning. Zhou Mu didn't have any attachment to the real world, especially after his parents passed away a few years ago. Compared to the company and his extended family, having just lived on in reality thanks to inertia, he often felt that the world in Doomsday Watchers was a reality that belonged to him alone. Now that he had really come to this world, he naturally felt uneasy and terrified. After all, this was a world where magic and gods truly existed, a world filled with danger. However, Zhou Mu focused slightly. The plethora of magic he had learned in-game naturally appeared in his mind. He felt that as long as he was willing, he could use such powers at any time, just like when he used teleportation. For a moment, he trembled from excitement. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that as a product of his perfect clear goal, the character named William Kane in this save was inexplicably powerful based on the game's framework and background story. In the game, other than some bosses that required special conditions to defeat, he was confident in taking down even the strongest hidden boss publicly accepted on the player forum: Incarnation of Nothingness. Zhou Mu took a deep breath and calmed down slightly. He needed to calm down now. Since he had transmigrated and become the perfect clear account of William Kane, he had to confirm the level of his strength and see how the mechanisms of his various abilities were different from in-game. Then, he had to find his former companions. But speaking of which, why has the Round Table Hall appeared to be in ruins? After making up his mind, Zhou Mu noticed that something was amiss. He looked around. For some reason, the previously gorgeous and magnificent round table looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. The murals on the dome had faded to an unrecognizable level. The Holy Spirit statue on the wall had been weathered into a beehive-like irregularity, and the flags hanging had long been reduced to dust. In the entire round table hall, only the obsidian round table and the heavy adamantine door remained intact. How long has it been? I left only a few minutes ago. None of this makes sense. Zhou Mu muttered in confusion before shaking his head. He had already transmigrated, so how could there be any logic? Perhaps he had transmigrated to an era many years later. With this in mind, the uneasiness in his heart increased. If he hadn't transmigrated to an era where the game plot happened, much of the information he knew would have lost its usefulness. More importantly, he didn't know if his companions could be found again. In short, he had to find someone to ask about the situation. At the very least, he had to figure out the era he was in. Life detection. Upon having this thought, Zhou Mu activated a support spell. Invisible ripples spread out from him, and soon, the entire Twilight Fortress was within his casting range. Any creature's outline would be outlined by light green lines after being touched by the invisible ripples, allowing Zhou Mu to see them even through obstacles. Unlike in-game where one could only detect humans or other medium-sized creatures, even small lifeforms like rats and insects were outlined here. Was this in line with the description of the skill in-game? Detection of all life auras in a large area. Zhou Mu suspected that creatures like bacteria had also been detected, but he couldn't see them. Zhou Mu stood up in thought. Lightning flashed on his right hand, and a deep spatial rift opened. His hand reached in and pulled out a staff that was completely made of frost. The tip of the staff was embedded with a blood-red magic sphere, and streams of light extended from the magic sphere to cover the entire staff like a spiderweb. Withering cold was the magical medium he used the most in-game, not because it was strong, but mainly because it looked very cool. The reason why Zhou Mu took out his magical medium was also very simple. He had seen the outlines of 3 human figures in the range of life detection. But other than one human figure on the ground that looked no different from a human, the other 2 had limbs that were too long for humans and huge heads. That distinct appearance reminded him of a monster in-game. Subdemon. It's actually inside the Twilight Fortress. Although Zhou Mu didn't know how much time had passed, Twilight Fortress was originally built to fend off demonic creatures from the Moon Realm. No demonic creature should be able to stroll around and retreat unscathed here. Zhou Mu rubbed the magical medium in his hand and thought to himself. This was the only thing that shouldn't have changed no matter how much time had passed. Chapter 3, Liliana. Liliana von Bergman lay on the dusty ground and stared blankly at the bats dancing in the air. As a student of Offa University's archaeology department in the Blackwater province, she would definitely have danced excitedly in this hall if she had come here in a more dignified manner. It was difficult to imagine how much missing documentary information could be excavated from a well-preserved relic from the Ko's dynasty. If she could reveal the discoveries here to the academic world, she might even be guaranteed a spot as an associate professor in the university's archaeology department. However, her mentality was completely different, having been brought into the ruins to be stockpiled as food by the subdemons. 2 subdemons with abnormally long limbs and huge heads were chewing on meat. She tried her best not to think about what meat it was in large mouthfuls as they smacked their lips while chatting about what to do with her next. So when can we start eating this woman? Is eating all that's on your mind? There's only one left. There will be none left once we finish her. We still have to stay here for some time. Then, it shouldn't be a problem to try a few mouthfuls as long as it's not fatal, right? Are you an idiot? The first bite will always be dedicated to the Lady of Starvation, Camilla. Can it still be used as a sacrifice after being bitten by you? We can't keep a living person by our side, right? What if we encounter some danger and don't have the time to pay attention to her, allowing her to escape? Wouldn't that leak our arrangements here? Yes, that makes sense. Then, turn her into rations like before. Having a living person by our side is indeed a latent risk. Draw the runes for the ritual first. The conversation between the subdemons threw Liliana into despair. She was under a paralysis spell. Even if she wanted to beg for mercy, she would be tongue-tied and unable to speak. In this situation, she couldn't do anything other than silently pray to the 7 holy spirits for a miracle to happen. One of the subdemons appeared in Liliana's line of sight. Its skin seemed to be covered in mold, and there were signs of rot and festering everywhere. It opened its mouth that covered half its face and extended its long forked tongue to lick her cheek. Don't be afraid, your soul will soon reach the Moon Realm and reunite with your friends. There, you can ask them if they suffered before they died and compare notes. The subdemon held a ceremonial serrated dagger and pointed at the bones on the ground while speaking in a teasing manner. They were her companions who came exploring this ruin with her. Not long after they stepped into this ruin, they were attacked and killed by these 2 subdemons. Daddy, Mummy, help me. Looking at the dagger that was gradually approaching her, Liliana closed her eyes in despair. Tap, tap, tap. It was also at this moment that light but very clear footsteps sounded from the corridor outside the front door. The hall immediately fell silent. Liliana opened her eyes in confusion. At this moment, the dagger-wielding subdemon was half kneeling beside her, exchanging looks with the subdemon who was drawing something on the ground with a piece of charcoal. It placed its slender fingers beside its orifice that could hardly be called a mouth and made a shushing motion. Then, it gently stabbed the dagger back into its belt and slowly pulled out a short sword smeared with green venom. As for the other subdemon, it gently placed the charcoal pencil on the ground and incanted something softly. A ball of flames quickly gathered on its palm and quickly turned into a spinning fireball. The footsteps approached. The 2 subdemons stared at the corner extending out the door and held their breaths. Liliana tried her best to make some noise to alert the person outside, but unfortunately, the effects of the paralysis spell were still obvious. She couldn't even move a finger. With the sound of footsteps approaching the corner of the door, the casting subdemon raised his hand, and the spinning fireball in his hand quickly shot out. Bang! An intense flare flashed, and the massive explosion seemed to shake the entire hall. The sliver of hope that Liliana had for escape was extinguished. The 2 subdemons looked at the surging flames outside the door and relaxed slightly. This was the end of common sense that had shaped Liliana's 16 living years. From her point of view, what happened next could only be described as unbelievable. Without any warning, a silver-white nexus appeared under the feet of the two subdemons. A powerful whirlwind instantly swept up the dust in the room and threw the two subdemons into the air. It was also the moment they floated in the air that two sharp ice thorns extended diagonally from the originally empty ground, accurately piercing through the two airborne subdemons. All of this happened so suddenly that Liliana only realized what had happened when the two subdemon corpses began to turn into black salt crystals and dissipate. Heavy footsteps sounded from the opposite direction of the explosion. She turned her eyeballs and looked over. Then, she saw the person. A man who seemed to have walked out of a legend emitted an aura of ice and blood. His face had signs of the elements, and his expression was a little gloomy. His grayish-white hair was disheveled, and his eyes flickered with silver light due to the abundant magic. His cheeks were slightly sunken, and his beard was more like a stubble. His skin was as pale as if it was covered in a layer of frost. He wore pitch-black bone armor, and the armor's shape was distorting and twisting like fire. Sharp bone spurs extended from his wrists and elbows as if they were growing on that person's body. The entire armor breathed, as if it were alive. Countless runes and totems were carved on the armor, and they alternated with ice blue and blood-red light. These light beams finally converged on a fist-sized black crystal in the center of the bone armor. He held a staff made of pure frost in his hand, and a blood-red orb was embedded at the tip. Fire, lightning, and frost lingered around the blood-colored orb. They were three powerful spells that had been incanted but hadn't been activated. Just looking at the magic power contained in them seemingly froze her soul. The person first looked around before slowly walking to a spot 3 steps away from Liliana. Are the two the only ones? The person stared into her eyes and asked. His voice was low and hoarse, carrying an indescribable authority. Perhaps it was because she was too shocked, but Liliana didn't understand what the other party meant for a moment. She only asked in a daze, "What two?" After speaking, Liliana realized that she could speak normally. At some point, the paralysis spell she had been under had been dispelled. Are they the only two subdemons here? The person repeated his question. There's only the two of them. Liliana hurriedly replied. The person looked around the hall again and said to her, "I've already dispelled the paralysis spell on you. Try and see if you can stand up on your own." Liliana moved her limbs that were almost numb and tried to stand up, but she couldn't muster any strength. Before she could speak, a green light flashed, and Liliana felt her limbs slowly begin to recover their strength. Thank you." The person only waved his hand and walked closer to ask. "There are some things I need to confirm first. What day and age is it?" Twilight Moon 24, or 25. "I've been under the paralysis spell for the past few days, so I'm not sure how many days have passed." "No, I'm asking what year it is." This question made Liliana's heart palpitate, and she wondered if this person was a heretical mage who had lived here in seclusion for so long that he had lost track of time. Yes, this was the only possibility. Otherwise, how could such a powerful mage be willing to lower himself into living in such a remote ruin? The more Liliana thought about it, the more certain she became. Then, she couldn't help but be struck by fear. She had heard that heretical mages couldn't use the magic power of the astral world because they had betrayed the astral laws. Therefore, they extracted and tortured the souls of others, using the pain and despair of their souls as fuel for their spells. Looking at the other party's eyes that emitted silver light due to the abundance of magic, Liliana lowered her head and avoided his gaze. She stared at her boots and answered hesitantly. Platinum Calendar, 1886. Hiss. Perhaps it was her imagination, but Liliana seemed to hear the mage gasp. But when she looked up again, the person still had the same gloomy expression. "Is there a problem? Let's not talk about this first. Do you know where those two subdemons come from?" Liliana replied, "I'm not sure. They only attacked us after my archaeological team entered this ruin, but a few days ago, when we were still in the Grief Mountains, the team scouts mentioned that something was following us, but we thought it was a beast like a direwolf." With that said, her voice became softer and softer. The man suspected to be a heretical mage nodded thoughtfully after hearing her description. "I roughly get it. Sorry, I need to know. Is anyone else on your archaeological team still alive?" This question made Liliana's heart sink as memories of the attack on her team surfaced in her mind. I hear something upstairs. Where did they come from?" "Well, protect the lady and leave first. By the Holy Spirit, that was a LV3 spell. They can see us. Light the torches. Run. No, please. Lily, save me, it's eating me." Everyone's voice in the archaeological team seemed to echo in her ears. Liliana bit her lip and took a long time to squeeze out 2 words. No. The emotions she had temporarily suppressed from fear and shock erupted. She covered her face with her hands, and tears kept streaming through her fingers. They're all dead, they were all eaten. After a long time, when she was done venting her emotions, the person placed a hand on her shoulder. Let's go. Let's solve the problem at its root first.